Okay, well, I think we've decided to talk to each other briefly about the rationale for our project called Towards an Australian Culturally Responsive Pedagogy. And we've got two rationales that we want to share, and then we're going to briefly outline 5 key concepts that we've been working with teachers on sort of redesigning their curriculum and pedagogies, and then we're going to finish up with briefly giving an example each about what some of the teachers have been doing. So would you, rehearse the sort of, the rationale related to sort of Indigenous young people in schools?
Well, one of the key aspects that we were quite concerned about, weren't we, when we started this project, were the problem of school delivery for the Aboriginal learner. And we came to the conclusion that despite 10 years of highly focus on numeracy and literacy in English only, and an attempt was needed to try and move beyond the issue of failure of schools to deliver to Aboriginal children. We made it also a particular aspect that Aboriginal outcomes were appalling in Australia, and has been for the last 10 years, despite a whole range of investment. And so we wanted to really bring some pedagogical shift, new ways of thinking around addressing Aboriginal outcomes. And so we wanted to look at the way in which invoking what students brought to the classroom, their assets, their life worlds, in which to validate, build and bridge from their local knowledges to the global knowledges, in a way to improve learning and achievement. And one of the things that we know after 10 years of abysmal failure by the systems to deliver on Aboriginal outcomes is the notion of the high demand that teachers have for a pedagogy to make some improvements in this area. Well, there is a whole range, large body of evidence also by parents, Aboriginal parents, who want their kids to improve in their learning, but also to maintain their identities and their sense of well-being and belonging.
So, I mean, when we were putting the project together, it was clear that, what was on the table for teachers around improving Indigenous kids' learnings, and to sort of mention 3, you've got Aboriginal perspectives across the curriculum, the sort of cultural competence frameworks and interculturality. All 3 of those seem to be failing. But then when we read the sort of, the Indigenous Education Archive across the Pacific Rim countries, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, Canada, North America, or US and South American archive, this notion of culturally responsive pedagogy starts to resonate really, really powerfully, and offering a sort of a hopeful alternative framework for thinking about what we might be doing. So, and then looking at how that concept plays in the Australian archive, it's very, very weakly developed theoretically and practically. So, I think that was the sort of connection to us between, appalling Indigenous student outcomes is sort of rife across those countries, but that particular concept appeared to be really hopeful. Now, the other sort of rationale, which sort of happens in parallel, and in the end, both of these rationales came together for us, didn't they? So, an alternative rationale for moving towards culturally responsive pedagogies is just the sort of empirical fact of the sort of increasing cultural diversity in our society, and the fact that cultural diversity walks into classrooms. So, we're now arguing that many schools and many classrooms we could argue are sort of super diverse with. We work in schools that have got 75 different nationalities. Many in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, which is where we do a lot of our work, will have 35, 45, 50 nationalities. In which case, again, what's available for teachers to sort of engage with sort of linguistic, cultural and sort of religious diversity of all the students that they find in their classrooms, and sort of old whitewashed curriculum just doesn't sort of work in this context. So Again, the sort of culturally responsive pedagogy archive looked like it was a sort of a hopeful place to do that work, even though I think, again, our reading of it was that mostly that archive was sort of written out of the sort of Indigenous education interest, but we could easily see how that could come together. And certainly when we started our project, we did make the rationale for the project funding on the basis of the first rationale, but all of a sudden within an hour of working with teachers, it's clear that they've got they work in the public school in the western and northern suburbs of Adelaide. They might have 2 or 3 Indigenous kids in their class with 15 or 20 other languages and cultural groups. So the sort of the Indigenous kids were sort of part of the cultural diversity, actually. So all of a sudden the two rationales combined, just in the sort of the reality that the normal public school teacher has to deal with in their classroom. So I think if we had more time, we could push a third rationale, which is I think underneath both of those, there's a sort of a need to sort of think past the sort of colonising project of the country, but that's perhaps for another moment. So maybe we can now sort of segue to the way we sort of structured up our project. And
before you do that, we are arguing in our project is that Australia has now moved beyond multiculturalism to the super diverse classroom, and that the super diverse learner brings a whole range of different strengths and complexities for teachers, and that the need for pedagogies in these classrooms are in high demand. And I think our cultural responsive pedagogies has given sort of these 5 provocations.
Yeah, so I mean, the sort of our project sort of based on bringing 2 big ideas together. So on the one hand, we shared with the sort of participating teachers, and we had teachers from about 10 schools. So in the end, there was about somewhere around 20 teachers that we were working with. We sort of shared the sort of culturally responsive pedagogy archive, or at least a sort of a representative sample. We shared our sort of summary of it, which was sort of 5 ideas, which we'll get to in a minute. And we provided a sort of a modality of professional learning that was sort of borrowing from the notion of action research. And so we had 2 whole year cycles of teachers engaging in doing some action research about what did they get up to when they attempted to sort of enact this culturally responsive pedagogy themes inside their own classrooms. That was the basic project. So the 5, I think Irabinna did a close read of a sort of some of the more significant papers out of that archive, including Gloria Ladson-Billings, Russell Bishop's work out of New Zealand, and perhaps the most powerful set of ideas came from sort of the Alaskan educators. I think Irabinna came up with 19 key themes, and we were clear that we could hardly go into our action research process with here's 19 ideas. So we tried to pick the eyes out of the 19 and come up with what we thought were the most important and maybe the most representative across the whole archive. And as the project unfolded, we ended up with these 5. So the first one was high intellectual challenge.
And when we named this, we were wanting to extend and go beyond the sort of the dominant view at the moment, which is the normative position of high expectation. And we came to the conclusion by reading the literature and working with our teachers that it's time to move beyond this, because every teacher has a high expectation of their students. But when you match this against in a challenge, hard fun, or the issue of improvement at your own rate, it seemed to us that we were invoking a high intellectual challenge in line with differentiation between the children at their needs and at their own rate, And we find that high expectation is a pedagogical tool that is just too ambiguous.
Well, I mean, one of the things that became clear as well as we got into it was the 5 ideas that we've got are sort of operating as a constellation. They're sort of shining on each other. So, I mean, it's not unusual to go into a school where teachers have high expectations, but it's a very old traditional idea which turns out to be one of the key problems when you're trying to actually engage in curriculum and pedagogy for inclusion. So we're not sort of asserting the sort of old unreconstructed version of giving them hard things to do. They're sort of it's sort of inflected with the other 4 ideas, but perhaps before we move on to the second one of the things that's quite clear across that Indigenous education archive is Indigenous families and communities across those countries have been saying for decades that they want their students to be doing hard things at school, not sort of low-level crap. So I think that was a really, really important idea for us. We can't see how we could be making an argument for a viable, high-quality education if that wasn't the sort of first key idea, albeit it needs to be inflected with the others. So I suppose it also sort of resonates with a whole range of other pedagogy frameworks that have been emerging in our country over the years. So this one's fairly straightforward, but on its own is inadequate. So our second key idea was pedagogies need to sort of connect up to the life worlds of your students.
And this is really critical, isn't it? Because connecting the two, high intellectual challenge, with the assets that the student and the learner is bringing, is a critical moment. In our provocations, we overlaid the view of the learner. What is the view of the learner that our educators have of the child? And you cannot get to this question unless you understand what is the linguistic and cultural repertoire as skills that the learner is bringing to the classroom. And so by invoking what are the assets that the child is bringing, and does my pedagogy leave too much of their intelligence on the floor, or does my pedagogy that is responsive to their linguistic and cultural repertoire captures most of the intelligences that's brought from home to class? And building on those. And I think that that's a critical point. So the 2 provocations of high intellectual challenge and life worlds, connecting to the life worlds that the children bring, are connected, aren't they?
I think so. I mean, one of the other things, of course, that sort of drives our project is trying to sort of respond to the sort of challenges that teachers talk to us about, and certainly in my work over 20 or 30 years. And if you go into the sort of disadvantaged schools in Australia, research, then one of the key challenges for teachers is how do you actually engage disaffected learners? This is sort of shot through the whole archive. So one of the key challenges then is about sort of engagement. So if teachers are just doing transmission pedagogies to kids, then that's just a failed project. There's no, we know that doesn't engage young people. So if you're not doing transmission, then somehow you're doing some dialogic approach, in which case you have to sort of engage with what the students are bringing. So again, I think both of those 2 ideas we've talked about so far are sort of anti-deficit. So in which case, when you're trying to think about what you might do productively as a teacher, you're not naming up all the things that students don't bring to class. You're trying to work out how you can connect with what they do bring, in which case that's a much more productive framework. So that then sort of pushes you to be sort of doing some different sorts of work. We're trying to find out what they do bring, what life world knowledges, sort of family experiences, literate practices, and we can go on with a sort of a big long, their knowledge of their own place, their engagement with popular culture, their aspirations for the future. All of these things are sort of topics for sort of conversation as part of what we're doing pedagogically.
So the 2 shifts that we're trying to make here is the view of the learner and the viewer of the educator. And so we were invoking that the educator becomes learner of the life worlds, a miner for their strengths, And so our version of ourselves as educator is really, really critical. If the Muslim learner brings a whole range of intelligences to the classroom, how do we capture that firstly? And then how do we link it to the national curriculum? These are critical moments, but we have to shift that we are just the teacher and the child brings nothing to the classroom, and that we're just going to do education to the child. You know, one of the key interesting things that that our research is trying to invoke is the notion that we can learn. The child teaches us many things, and to connect the teacher with the learner and the teacher as learner is critical.
I think also here, I mean, there's been many versions of that idea that have played out, and some of the sort of variations in the sort of 1980s. Teachers forgot to do the sort of official curriculum and ended up doing really sort of low-level things. And I think probably there's a wonderful paper by Lisa Delpit, which is now quite old, which is sort of mandatory reading in this space, where she sort of argues that when you're teaching other people's children, which is the title of the paper, then you need to be connecting up to their life worlds, but providing opportunities for them to sort of learn what she calls the powerful codes. So I think our two first ideas are really just variations on Lisa Delpit's argument, which is, I still think, quite sort of compelling. And maybe on the sort of life world knowledge is one of the other productive concepts that our project tried to bring to the table was the concept of that young people bring their own funds of knowledge, which is again a sort of a productive way to think about life world knowledges.
It's interesting, isn't it, when the Aboriginal child and the Muslim learner comes to school and they've got their linguistic, a whole range of different linguistic repertoires, a whole range of cultural knowledges. Aboriginal knowledges are 80,000 years old. They're the oldest people on the planet. And there are numerous Aboriginal languages that are diverse. The first universities in the world were Islamic. And so when the Muslim learner and the Aboriginal learner and the other diverse learners bring their cultural knowledge to class and they want to catch that cultural credibility and collateral in, sometimes the teacher is only wanting to buy the English-only literacy and numeracy. And they can be constructed as, the children could be constructed as failures, when in actual fact they have all of these strengths and all of these intelligences.
The next third idea is probably sort of spins out of the second one, really. I think if you're doing the second idea, the connecting up to kids' life worlds well, you end up with a third one, but to state it carefully, and there's sort of two variations. I think we're arguing that all young people should feel positive about their own cultural identities in our classes. So what does that mean pedagogically? Or alternatively, you could argue that the same idea means that when a teacher walks into a class, they understand the sort of cultural differences in their classrooms as assets for learning and not deficits. So. You want to riff on that one?
Well, it goes right back to the intellectual giants of Dewey and Vygotsky around the notion that engagement of the child's sense of belonging is really critical for learning and achievement. And so we drew on these intellectual giants and the literature that suggests that to engage is a sense of and to build learning. And to build on to the knowledges that the child is bringing for increased success and achievement is the notion of making sure that everyone belongs in the classroom. All people, we learn about ourselves through others, and the diversity of the classroom improves everybody's learning. And that this was a critical moment when we developed this third criteria, or as a provocation for our set of culturally responsive pedagogy.
Yeah, I think if you're doing the culturally responsive line, then one's cultural identity's got to be sort of one of the sort of serious considerations about what one's doing. But certainly, I don't know, in my own critiques of the sort of traditional curriculum, there were many examples where Indigenous young people are in classrooms and their cultural identities are either radically silenced or worse, even maligned by the sort of traditional curriculum. So many Aboriginal young people have been in our classrooms in the last couple of decades, not at all feeling positive about their own cultural identities, but probably the flip side of that. So if we're trying to be culturally responsive, then clearly we've got to turn that around. And I guess using both of our rationales, it's not just about the Indigenous kids, but all of the sort of cultural groups in our classrooms. And again we can. We could mention here specifically, religious differences as well. So, how does the Muslim child feel positive about the sort of Islamic traditions that they're sort of connecting up to, or and we can go on with sort of other variations on that theme.
Well, what are the things that we have captured is the barriers to learning success. And one of those is the cancelling of religiosity or the linguistic and cultural repertoire of the child in the classroom. Cancelling that out does inhibit learning and puts the diverse learner vulnerable. If their sense of belonging is vulnerability in the classroom, then so will their learning and achievement.
I think one of the other things that we learned, as a generic idea as well, you've got, again, you go back to, who's the cohort in the class. You've got a few Indigenous kids, you've got 15 other cultural groups, and the rest of the class are sort of white Anglo kids. All three of those groups have got sort of different cultural needs actually in Australian classrooms. So that's sort of quite complicated for teachers to be able to sort of mediate all of that. But I think again traditionally culture's been sort of absent as a sort of a key idea, and sort of the hidden curriculum really is that the sort of the white Anglo kids they fared okay, but the others didn't do quite so well.
Well, when you invoke the child as an inquirer of their own life worlds, connected to the national curriculum, we see this as a powerful tool.
And then our sort of fourth idea goes back to something which is maybe of a sort of a different order. And we've got sort of two ideas in here really, because it's around themes related to what's happening at the sort of assessment end of the process. And in the first instance, most of the teachers' case studies, they were pushing their students to perform their learning for an audience bigger than just them, and that seems to sort of add a sort of virtuous circle to the whole arrangement. I mean, if the kids are doing, or if the students are doing something worthwhile, then sharing it with an audience seems highly appropriate actually. So, and then the demand that you're going to share your learning with an audience sort of adds to the sort of motivation and the sort of interest. And of course, we're now living in a time when we're trying to move away from pen and paper versions of learning into using new technology. So many of the teachers were engaging their students in preparing sort of multimodal variations of what they learned and sharing it with an audience.
And what we know from the evidence at the moment is that Aboriginal children are highly digital children. And so using the multimodal as well as performing learning for people other and communities and families other than the teacher ticks off two big things for Aboriginal parents. The community want to see that the school is responsive to the community needs. The parents and families want to see what their children are doing. And so getting the child to rehearse their knowledge production that is responsive to their community needs and interests are really critical. One of the fascinating things is social media has become quite strong, and this is coming into the classroom whether the teacher likes it or not. But using and leveraging digital media is a really critical moment for a whole range of purposes. Some of our communities that we work with and teachers in our communities are extremely poor. They are economic inequity across Australia is growing. And so we need pedagogies that deal with using and leveraging digital world to make it accessible and democratic and inclusive for those outside of the class, but also for those in.
I think this fourth idea also captures a couple of other things that are important. On the one hand, often teachers that sort of move over in this direction that we're advocating for negotiate curriculum with young people and end up with 25 different things going on in the class, and the class disappears, which actually works. The learning improves, but it's impossible to sustain in the long term because you've just got too many things going. So it's very, very important, I think, to try and maintain a class, in which case the class comes back together, at least here at the end, where they're all sharing their learning with others. As well, I think one of the things that's important in our approach is that young people aren't just recodifying already existing knowledge for the benefit of proving to their teacher they can do that. They're actually involved in learning activities where they're producing their own knowledge. And I think the sort of, again, our fourth theme sort of captures those sort of ideas. And perhaps finally, the last idea is our approach is trying to pursue a sort of an activist orientation for the learning.
And one of the things that we're meaning by activism is to improve the lives and the communities in which the children come from. So it is critical inquiry, it's child as inquirer, to try and solve some of the key issues of our time, but particularly these things that impact in the children's lives. So some of our children are living next to polluted rivers. Some of our children live in crowded houses. And what we've also got is a diversity of experience. And so the activism mode in which we put into our research is where the student aligns with reform movements in society to make a difference to the life worlds inside and outside of the school.
And this was probably the sort of most controversial and maybe the more sort of difficult one for us to sort of engage with, and certainly there was no sort of precursor normal version of what this sort of looked like. Perhaps there was many variations. I think probably very good primary school teachers for decades have been trying to actually generate a sort of an experience of being democratic in their class. So learning how to be democratic in a class, I think, ticks the sort of activist box. One of our teachers took the sort of posters that her students had produced in an Aboriginal history unit, put them on the wall in the staff room during the evening when it was parent interview night, and the parents got to see all of these posters, in which case we think that young people's posters were educating their family about Indigenous history. We think that ticked the activist box because the children were actually playing an educative role with their own communities and especially their own families. They are sort of two examples which are not too far away from what really good teachers do anyway. So the sort of again variations on a theme about what the sort of activist thing might look like. But perhaps what we can do here is just quickly rehearse sort of two case studies of what some of the teachers got up to. And did you want to have share an example related to your rationale, the sort of Indigenous kids learning rationale?
So a highly diverse high school, a teacher that was walking into class and finding a super diverse classroom, but the dialogue was non-existent. There wasn't a sharing of life worlds. The Muslim learners sat in the corner, the Asian learners in another corner, the Aboriginal, they weren't integrated. And so she found it quite frustrating in trying to deliver good outcomes and was getting a high absenteeism. So one of the key challenges in using a CRP provocation, culturally responsive pedagogies, was to improve dialogue, to improve attendance, to improve engagement as a entrance into transition to work, but also...
Just to sort of interrupt here, I mean, the way that you've sort of just described that, it just sort of sounds like what goes on in lots and lots of classrooms actually. You've got a particular sort of existential dynamic around sort of a lack of engagement or conversation, which many of our teachers actually named up as being the thing they wanted to engage with actually. So there was we've got 5 abstract ideas, but when we come to talk to teachers, they're talking about these quite straightforward existential challenges that they've got, and trying to bring both of, you know, our abstract ideas as a sort of a way of trying to sort of engage with something that is very familiar to teachers, what you've just described. Anyway, sorry.
That's actually right. And so ours, when this teacher came to the Cultural Responsive Pedagogy professional development, she already had a positive sense of her learner and the learners. She wanted some skills to capture their life worlds. And she had a view of learning which was wanting to try and build on to their interests with the national curriculum. And so she needed a technique to get them to talk and to democratically include all of the voices, because there were some that were overriding others. So teamwork was a really critical element. And because she had lots of Aboriginal students, she wanted to invoke and bring on an elder in the community. And so the elder used a yarning circle approach, which is ancient in the Ngarrindjeri community and the Narungga community here in South Australia. And so these children were quite familiar with yarning pedagogies, whereby everyone sits in a circle, and there is a rehearsal of acknowledgement of country, and then bringing your experiences to the circle. And everyone that sits in that circle belongs, and everyone that sits in their circles, life worlds and views are valid. And so once she used the sort of yarning circles in dialogue with the culturally responsive 5 provocations that we set, she found that the students were beginning to try and understand each other's life worlds that they hadn't known before. And so Muhammad in the classroom was sharing about how his family came to Australia, and how the Indigenous groups were talking about how they saw the world and what their views of knowledge were. And all of a sudden, by using the national curriculum, they were beginning this conversation that she had to stop. She had to redirect. She hadn't had this amount of dialogue before. And so invoking life worlds, seeing the students' knowledges as asset, and then connecting it to the curriculum seemed to really bring some amazing results in terms of their engagement. Learning was still a little bit shaky, but in the second year she was trying to move it towards more of a rigorous engagement with learning and achievement. But the first year of the project, she was just trying to get the kids to talk.
Yeah, so when we put out our 5, one key idea that was evident in that archive we were describing before was sort of making stronger connections to community. And certainly which for us is sort of contained within our second idea around life worlds, but inviting sort of a community elder into the class to sort of model a particular pedagogical practice and sort of share Indigenous perspectives seemed like the sort of relay point that really sort of shifted the dynamic here.
And you've got your other example, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I've got another example which was out of my rationale, a Year 9 English teacher teaching a fairly conventional poetry unit. In fact, when he described what the unit was, many of us in the room had actually been in classrooms in Year 9 in 1960s with that same sort of the same text. We all burst into laughter actually when we realised that he was doing something that we all did 30 or 40 years ago. But anyway, on the basis of our sort of provocations, it was a unit on World War I poetry, reading Wilfred Owen, and people who watch this who are my age will remember that very sort of curriculum idea. So he changed the unit to survival, and on the basis of his reading of the students in his room, he decided that he would no longer be, it would be no longer dominated in the first instance by Wilfred Owen poems, but he found a set of texts which were more representative of the sort of cultural groups in the room, and as an example, they were reading Anne Doe's survival story, which is one that's doing the rounds in schools for some time now, and there were quite a lot of Vietnamese kids in the room. You can imagine how the Vietnamese kids finding Anne Doe's book a little bit more compelling than Wilfred Owen. So he sort of enlarged the sort of culturally responsive texts at the beginning, which changes his relationship with his students and sort of increases sort of the engagement with the texts. And then at the end of the unit, again, it's a poetry unit, so the major assessment task is writing some poetry. So small tweak on the task, and all of a sudden he's asking his students to draft up poetry survival stories from their own family. So the students have to go home, do the research with their family, and then generate survival stories from their own families, and then they write the poetry. And again, you can see how it's sort of perhaps a sort of a strong example of how you can connect up your curriculum work with the life worlds of your students. So rather than sort of writing abstract poems that have nothing to do with your lives, all of a sudden, again, just a little tweak, all of a sudden his class is producing knowledge about all of their families, the sort of history of their families, sharing it with the rest of the class. And again, I think we had a teacher in the previous year who, in her year 12 class, did something quite similar. And when the class got to near the end of the sharing of all the sort of knowledges they produced, they'd all realised they'd been together for 12 years at school, and they'd never ever once had an opportunity to share their own sort of life family experiences with each other. And it was a sort of a shocking admission actually about how what goes on in school classrooms is sort of completely dissonant with what's going on in the kids' lives. It's like a completely separate reality.
And what our teachers in these two case examples and the others inside of our project find is that the 5 key ideas aren't necessarily recipes, but their intention were there to be provocations. Of course, they're all interrelated and they're all interconnected. You couldn't have high intellectual challenge and only seeming to invoke that without life worlds. So all of them are interconnected in some ways, but they are a series of provocations, and we invite the educator to build enriching learning experiences co-constructed with the students, and the students as inquirers to investigate their own life worlds. One of the other things that we also found was that the educators came to and the teachers came to a view of what CRP is not. And that is just a celebration of culture during Harmony Day or NAIDOC Week or Reconciliation Week. That it's more than that. It's connecting life worlds to learning. It's not just a celebration of religious folk festivals or community celebration days. That's not where it stands. And so our educators and teachers were clear that what CRP is not, and that is just celebrating, or just putting up posters, or the Nunga room, or just bringing an invited speaker in without any connection to learning.
Yeah, I think one of the things which happened, or one of the things we learned here was on the basis of what really was a quite small project. Teachers over 1 year being very thoughtful and researchful about retweaking their teaching in 1 4 or 5 week unit, on the basis of that experience sort of changing how they sort of understood themselves and their students and the relationship to knowledge, which then sort of spilled over into all the classrooms that they sort of engaged with subsequently. That was certainly in our data. But maybe sort of the final thing we could say. We had our 5 themes. I did mention a 6th one, which we think's embedded, but the one that sort of haunts them all was the theme about relationships. So I think you and I both were heard to say many times that what we were really doing in our project was changing the nature of the relationships between the teachers and their students. And I think if we go back and re-listen to this video, then that theme's sort of evident, I think, in a lot of the ways that we've been talking. But certainly, to give that a little bit of content, from my perspective anyway, one of the things that's really important here, if we're taking the relationships seriously, then I think fundamentally we're advocating for sort of sharing power in the classroom, so giving kids more choices about what they're doing in classrooms that are sort of managed and mediated by the sort of teacher's own sort of professional knowledge. But as soon as young people are given more control over what's going on, then that changes the nature of the relationship between the teacher and the student. And from our perspective, increases engagement and increases student achievement.
I think you're right, and what our project does show, that pedagogical shift it does occur, and one of the things that is critical is the relationship building. And I think the sort of the big shift around relationship through CRP is you can only get to this shift unless you're reassessing as educators our view of the learner and a view of their life worlds, the view of ourselves as educators, the view of what learning is, the view of knowledge, what knowledge is, whose knowledge is privileged in my classroom, the voice that we give to students, and how we play that out and allow some students to speak over others and other voices to be silent over others. And we also, in order to build more relationships, we have to have a sort of a sense of a view of the curriculum. So the view of the learner, the view of knowledge, and the view of the teacher, and the view of curriculum. Once we start to really sort of examine these and how we see these as the teacher, gets us to a far more comprehensive, enriching relationship with our students.
And maybe just as sort of an advertisement at the end, if you want to read more in the next few months, our website will be available, and you can find the link to our website, our project's website, from either of our web pages. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.